My daughter-in-law looked me dead in the eye and said her entire family would be spending Christmas here at my house, all 30 of them. I just smiled, took a sip of my coffee, and told her that was absolutely perfect. I let her know I was heading to Park City for the holiday, and that she was welcome to cook and clean for every last one of them herself, because I am not her servant. Every drop of color left her face. She went white as a sheet. But what she didn't yet know, the thing that would leave both her and my son flat broke, and without a roof over their heads, was still waiting for her. My name is Gerald, 71 years old, and I spent 4 decades as a structural engineer. Bridges, commercial, high-rises, parking garages, I designed and built them all. My whole career trained me to calculate load-bearing weight, to spot stress fractures before they spread, and to know the exact moment a foundation stops holding. Lorraine and I poured everything we had into our dream home, a quiet, well-heeled suburb just outside Indianapolis, Indiana. 4 bedrooms, a full brick colonial sitting on a double lot, with old oak trees standing guard on every side. Welcome back to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to you, consider following along so you never miss one. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something about knowing a story like Gerald's is reaching people in all kinds of different corners of the world. That means a great deal to me. A quick note before we continue: some details in this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters most is the message it carries. It was our sanctuary. Lorraine passed away 7 years ago, taking a massive piece of my heart with her, but leaving behind a house filled with beautiful memories. I kept the property in meticulous order. It was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. That all changed 3 years ago when my son Derek and his wife Melissa appeared at my door with a sob story and a moving truck. Derek is 34 years old, my only child, and it pains me to admit that somewhere along the way, I failed to put a spine in him. He married Melissa 5 years ago. Melissa is 32, consumed by social media appearances and chasing a lifestyle she has no business affording. 3 years ago, Derek claimed their landlord was hiking the rent to an impossible rate. They asked if they could take over my spare bedrooms for just 6 months. 6 short months, they swore, just long enough to build up a solid down payment on a place of their own. Being a father, I opened my doors. I cleared out 2 guest rooms and gave them room to breathe. They never left. The gulf between our daily routines was the first crack in the foundation. I am an early riser. Every morning at 5 I am up and moving. I brew a pot of black coffee, work through the morning paper, and take in the absolute stillness of the dawn. My space stays clean, organized, and respected. Melissa and Derek, by contrast, treat my home like a boutique hotel where invisible staff is expected to handle whatever they leave behind. Melissa never surfaces before 10 in the morning. When she finally drags herself out, she stumbles into the kitchen, complains if I am making the slightest noise, and fires up her expensive, cloying caramel latte pods. She carries her cup into the living room, settles onto the antique sofa, and sets her dripping mug directly on Lorraine's favorite antique mahogany coffee table. No coaster, no consideration. Day after day, I wipe away the water rings, quietly absorbing the low-grade disrespect that has soaked into every corner of my own home. The resentment truly began to harden the afternoon Derek brought the new car home. It was a crisp autumn day when a brand new, fully loaded silver luxury SUV rolled up my driveway. Derek climbed out of the driver's seat with a smug, arrogant swagger, flipping the keys in his hand. Melissa burst through the front door, squealing and clapping like they'd just hit a jackpot. I stepped out onto the porch, drying my hands on a dish towel, and asked him point blank, how he managed to afford an $85,000 vehicle while supposedly living rent-free to save for a mortgage. Derek wouldn't even meet my eyes. He gave a dismissive wave and claimed it was a big work bonus, a reward for standout performance at the logistics firm, where he holds down a mid-level management post. I wanted to believe him. A father always wants to believe his son is getting somewhere. But structural engineers don't run on hope. We run on data. 2 days later, the data showed up on its own. I was sorting through the mail on the kitchen counter when I spotted a bank statement addressed to both of us, a joint emergency savings account I had opened for Derek when he turned 18. I had seeded it with $30,000, with one explicit instruction: emergencies only, medical bills, a sudden job loss, a genuine crisis. I slid open the envelope. The balance was zero. He had drained it completely, every cent pulled to cover the down payment and upfront lease costs on that ridiculous SUV. I stood there in the kitchen, holding the document that confirmed my son was both a liar and a thief. A younger, hotter-blooded man might have charged upstairs, kicked the bedroom door off its hinges, and demanded the keys back. I did none of that. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch a thing. I folded the bank statement with care, walked into my home office, and locked it away in the safe. Then I stood at the window and watched Derek proudly buff the hood of his stolen luxury car in my driveway. In that moment, something inside me shifted permanently. I stopped seeing Derek as a son who needed steering. I began seeing him as a structural liability. The silent ledger of their offenses was now officially open, and I intended to collect on every line item. The peak of their arrogance arrived on an ordinary Tuesday night. I had retreated to my study around 8:00 in the evening, looking to get through a historical biography in peace. Without a word of warning, the front door flew open, and a wave of loud, obnoxious voices, at least a dozen of them, poured into the house. Melissa had decided to throw an impromptu dinner party for her crowd. Heavy bass started thumping through the walls. Heels clicked across the hardwood, and the sharp carrying sound of Melissa's performance laughter rang down the hallway. I stayed in my study, riding out the intrusion, hoping they would confine themselves to the dining room. An hour passed. Then the study door swung open, no knock. Melissa stood in the frame wearing a cocktail dress and holding an empty wine glass. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't acknowledge the noise. She looked at me with that entitled smirk of hers and announced that her guests were running low on drinks. She told me directly to head down to the cellar and bring up 3 bottles of the Good Reserve Red as though I were hired staff. She said it at full volume, making sure her friends in the hallway caught every word. I studied her carefully painted face. I closed my book, rose from my chair, and walked down to the cellar without a sound. I retrieved the wine, handed it over without a syllable, and returned to my study, turning the lock behind me. I let her have her small moment of authority. The real breaking point came the following morning. I was up at my usual 5 zoozer and walked into the kitchen. What greeted me was a disaster zone. Half-eaten plates of artisanal cheese and crackers sat rotting on the counters. Empty, sticky wine glasses were piled in the sink. My good pots and pans were crusted with burned food and strewn carelessly across the stove. I moved through into the living room. The air was stale and flat, and there, square in the center of Lorraine's favorite Turkish rug, was a massive dark stain of spilled red wine. It had soaked down through the fibers left to dry and set through the night. I didn't go upstairs and wake them. I went to the utility closet, pulled out the heavy-duty carpet cleaner, filled the reservoir with hot water and solution, and carried it to the living room. Then I got down on my hands and knees in the early morning quiet. I scrubbed the rug. I cleaned the kitchen. I bagged their garbage and washed their dishes. Anyone who had seen me might have taken me for a beaten old man, submissive, hollowed out, playing housekeeper in a home he owned outright. They would have been dead wrong. As I worked the last of the wine out of the fibers of the rug Lorraine had loved, my mind was absolutely clear. This was not defeat. This was the slow, deliberate sharpening of a blade. I knew precisely what I was going to do. I was going to take apart their entire lives piece by piece, and they wouldn't feel the ground giving way until it was already gone. By mid-November, the air across Indiana had turned bitter and gray. The oaks in my backyard had dropped their last leaves, standing bare against a freezing wind. Inside, I kept the thermostat at a steady, comfortable level, trying to hold on to the calm I had spent years building. That afternoon, I had been slow roasting a pork loin with root vegetables, a recipe Lorraine and I used to fall back on every year when the cold moved in. The smell of it filled the kitchen and offered a brief pocket of warmth. Derek and Melissa came downstairs just as I was pulling the roasting pan from the oven. As was customary, neither had offered to help, and neither had contributed a single item to the groceries. Melissa walked into the kitchen with her phone welded to her hand, thumbs hammering at the screen. She dropped into her chair at the dining table without so much as a glance in my direction. Derek shuffled in behind her, looking wrung out from his management job, sinking into the seat beside his wife. I plated the food without a word and set everything on the table. We ate for several minutes with no sound beyond cutlery against porcelain. I preferred that quiet to listening to Melissa hold court about difficult co-workers or a barista who couldn't get her order right. But the silence that particular evening had weight to it, thick and loaded with something unspoken. Melissa kept stealing glances from her screen to Derek, then back again. She took a slow sip of water, cleared her throat, and placed the phone face down on the table. "I'm finalizing the holiday itinerary," she said, her tone airy and offhand, as though she were making small talk about the forecast. "Just wanted to give you a heads up about Christmas this year." I kept my eyes on my plate and went on cutting my food. "A heads up," I repeated slowly. "Yes." She went on reclining in her chair with the ease of someone who has never once been told no. "My family usually rents a ski lodge or heads down to a resort, but this year everyone decided they wanted a traditional home-style Christmas, so I offered to host them here." I stopped chewing. I set my fork down on the table. The sheer nerve packed into that word host rang through my head. She was volunteering to host a gathering in a house she didn't own without a word to the man who wrote the property tax checks. "I see," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "And exactly how many people are we expecting for this cozy gathering?" Melissa waved a hand through the air, swatting the question away, like it was a minor inconvenience. "Oh, nothing outrageous. Just the immediate extended family. My parents, both sisters and their husbands, the kids, Uncle Ned and his new wife, a few cousins. It comes to about 30 people. They're flying in on the 20th and staying through the day after Christmas. 30 people. A full week." I let that number settle. 30 loud, demanding, entitled bodies trampling my hallways, scuffing my hardwood-breaking dishes, and treating my home like a no-cost bed and breakfast. My mind ran the calculation instantly: 36 people in a 4-bedroom house. It would be pure chaos. Before I could even begin to form a reply, Melissa reached into the pocket of her designer cardigan and produced a thick, neatly folded sheaf of heavy cardstock paper. She didn't hand it to me. She slid it across the polished table surface and let it come to rest, right beside my dinner plate. "Since I'll be completely occupied managing the aesthetic and the decor," she said, her voice laced with artificial warmth, "I need you to handle the shopping this week." I looked down at the papers. I didn't reach for them. I simply stared at the neat rows of printed text. "It's quite a list," she added, folding her arms across her chest. But we want everything to be perfect. My parents have very particular tastes. You know how they are. I picked up the stack of pages. This was no ordinary grocery list. A normal grocery list has milk, eggs, bread, maybe a bird or a ham for the holiday table. This was a sprawling, multi-page luxury manifesto. The first page alone called for 3 massive dry-aged ribeye roasts, exclusively from a high-end organic butcher downtown. The second page was devoted entirely to dairy and charcuterie imported French camembert aged Spanish manchego artisanal flatbread crisps and fresh black truffles. I turned to the final page where she had laid out the beverages. 4 cases of a specific vintage champagne, a label I knew retailed at over $100 a bottle. Premium Scotch craft beers, imported sparkling waters. I ran the numbers in my head in seconds. The food alone would run into thousands. The alcohol would double it. She had slid a bill for roughly $5,000 across my dining table and was instructing me to cover it. I looked up from the pages and met her eyes. "You want me to purchase all of this?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "Well, yes." She sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were being deliberately obtuse. "I literally just told you I don't have the time. I have to coordinate matching family pajamas, book a photographer for Christmas Eve, and work out the floral arrangements for the dining room. I'm already exhausted just thinking about it." Derek finally decided to contribute something. His tone was soft and conciliatory, the voice of a man who had signed away his own dignity without a fight. "Come on, Dad," he muttered, still not looking at me. "It would be a huge help. You've got the big trunk in your car and you have plenty of time during the day. It's the holidays. We should all pitch in. Pitch in." The phrase turned to ash in my mouth. They weren't asking me to pitch in. They were commanding me to fund and execute a luxury banquet for people I barely knew and had no interest in knowing. Melissa's parents were cast from the same mold as she was arrogant and hollow. The last time they visited, her father had complained about the brand of coffee I was serving while seated on a sofa I had paid for. I looked at Melissa. She was practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. She genuinely believed she had won. She had read 3 years of my silence, 3 years of scrubbing wine stains and absorbing utility bills without complaint, and concluded I was a broken, compliant old man. A convenient wallet. An unpaid house servant. I held the multi-page list in both hands. The paper felt weighted heavy with the full measure of their contempt. I could have flung it back across the table. I could have raised my voice. I could have told them both to start packing that very night. But an explosion would only hand them a narrative, make me the unreasonable one, the bitter old man who couldn't keep it together. A structural engineer understands that the most catastrophic collapses don't come with a bang. They come in silence when the load-bearing elements are quietly pulled away, one by one, until the whole structure folds under its own weight. I creased the list carefully along its original folds. I tucked it into the breast pocket of my shirt. I looked at Melissa, then at Derek, and let a slow, agreeable smile settle across my face. "I understand," I said evenly. "You're absolutely right. You have a great deal to manage with the decorations. I'll handle the shopping." Melissa lit up, releasing a loud, theatrical exhale of relief. "Thank goodness," she said, already reaching for her phone. "Make sure you get to the butcher by Thursday. They run out of the better cuts if you leave it to the weekend." I gave a single nod. I collected my empty plate, brought it to the sink, and washed it in silence. Then I walked out of the kitchen, feeling their eyes on my back, both of them completely blind to the fact that they had just handed me the exact instruments I needed to take their lives apart. I stood at the kitchen sink, with warm water running over my hands. The heavy cardstock of the grocery list pressed against my chest from inside my shirt pocket. a tangible reminder of their audacity. I thought the conversation had run its course. I thought the demands for the evening had hit their ceiling. I reached for a dish towel and dried my hands, slowly letting the rhythm of it settle me. But then Melissa's manicured nails began tapping against the dining table and the brief quiet shattered. She wasn't done. "Oh, there's one more logistical thing we need to sort out," she said, her voice utterly free of hesitation. "It's about the sleeping arrangements." I didn't turn around right away. I folded the dish towel with care and draped it over the oven handle. I drew a slow breath, steadying myself for whatever new indignity she had produced. When I finally turned to face her, she was already scrolling through her phone, not even granting me the courtesy of eye contact while she spoke. "So I've mapped out where everyone is sleeping," she continued, gesturing loosely toward the hallway. "The kids will be on sleeping bags in the living room. My sister and her husband get the east guest room. My brother takes the west guest room. The cousins will be on air mattresses in my home office." She paused. She looked up, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. "But that leaves my parents. And frankly, Gerald, the guest rooms simply aren't suitable for them. They're getting older. My mother has a bad back. She can't be walking down the hall to a shared bathroom in the middle of the night. It's just not hospitable. We're hosting them, and they need their own private attached bathroom. They need the master suite." The words hung there. The master suite. My bedroom. The room Lorraine and I had shared for 40 years. It was not simply a place to sleep. It was a space consecrated by 4 decades of marriage. The room where Lorraine and I had sat up past midnight talking about Derek's future when he was still a little boy. Where we had laughed, where we had wept, and where in the end I had held Lorraine's hand as she drew her last breath. Every inch of that room was sacred to me. The heavy oak dresser we had picked up at an estate sale on our 5th anniversary, the reading chair by the bay window where Lorraine used to sit with her morning tea. That room was a living museum of my life with the woman I had loved, and Melissa wanted me to vacate it so her parents could treat it like a complimentary hotel suite. I stared at her, absorbing the sheer magnitude of what she was asking. "I see," I said, my voice dropping to something quiet and deliberate. "And if your parents are occupying my bedroom, where exactly do you expect me to sleep for the duration of this week-long visit?" Melissa didn't even blink. "Well, I was thinking you could just take the pull-out couch down in the basement. It's only for a few days, and you're an early riser anyway, so you won't be in anyone's way down there. It just makes the most logistical sense. The basement." She wanted to exile me to the unfinished basement in the dead of an Indiana winter. That basement was essentially a concrete box where I kept holiday decorations, old paint cans, and seasonal tools. It was drafty, damp, and perpetually cold. The pull-out couch she was referring to was a battered wreck I had bought 30 years ago for a hunting cabin. The mattress was paper-thin, stained with age, and carried a faint smell of mildew. Worse, there was a broken metal spring right in the center that drove into the back of anyone unlucky enough to lie on it. She was sentencing me to a freezing concrete cell to sleep on a broken metal spring. While strangers occupied the bed I had shared with my late wife, a slow, cold fire lit itself in the center of my chest. Not the hot, blinding fury of a younger man, the precise, absolute clarity of an engineer watching a bridge fail under a load it was never designed to carry. There was no walking this back. The line had not merely been crossed, it had been wiped from the map entirely. But before I said a word, I pulled my eyes away from Melissa and fixed them on my son. Derek was sitting right there at that table. He had heard every syllable. He knew what that bedroom meant to me. He knew the weight of grief I still carried for his mother. He knew exactly what that freezing, unfinished basement looked like. I held my gaze on him and waited. I was offering him one final opportunity to be a man, one last chance to find his spine, to push back, to tell his wife she had gone too far. I wanted him to say no. I needed him to say that his father would not be treated like a stray dog under his own roof. Derek felt the weight of it. He shifted in his chair, shoulders curling inward. He lifted his fork and began dragging a leftover piece of roasted carrot across his plate. He would not look at me. The silence stretched, thick, suffocating, pressing against the walls. I waited. I watched him physically contract under the combined force of his wife's dominance and his own staggering cowardice. At last, Derek opened his mouth. What came out was a pathetic, barely audible mumble. "Come on, Dad," he said, eyes fixed on the scratches in his ceramic plate. "It's really not that big of a deal. It's only for a week, Dad. Just let them have the room. It'll make things easier for everyone." "It's only for a week, Dad." Those 7 words sealed his fate. In that exact moment, the last remaining thread of paternal obligation I still felt toward my son came loose and dissolved entirely. I looked at the top of his bowed head and felt nothing. Not anger, not disappointment, just the cold, sterile detachment that comes when you decide to discard a broken tool that can no longer serve its purpose. He was no longer a son to protect. He was simply another occupant of my property. I turned back to Melissa. She was practically glowing with her victory. She had pushed against the ultimate boundary and found no resistance. She had confirmed for herself that she was the undisputed ruler of my home, and that my son would serve happily as her foot soldier. I let out a slow, measured breath. I smoothed the front of my shirt. I looked at the 2 of them sitting at the dining table. I had purchased the table where I had fed Derek every night of his childhood. I arranged my face into a pleasant, cooperative expression. "You make a very practical point, Melissa." I said, my tone smooth and unruffled. "Logistically speaking, it does make sense. I wouldn't want your parents uncomfortable navigating the hallway at night. I'll clear my personal items out of the master suite this weekend and get set up in the basement." Melissa clapped her hands together, a sharp, ringing note of triumph. "Perfect," she said, bright, sliding her phone back into her pocket. "I knew you'd understand, Gerald. I'm going to text my mom right now and let her know she gets the big room with the jacuzzi tub. She is going to be so thrilled." Derek finally lifted his eyes from his plate and offered me a limp, apologetic half-smile. "Thanks, Dad," he whispered. "I appreciate it." "I did not say you are welcome." I turned my back to both of them and walked out of the kitchen. I moved down the hallway, my footsteps silent against the hardwood. I reached the door to my private study, the one room in the house I kept under lock and key. I turned the key, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the dark, still space. I didn't reach for the overhead light. I crossed to my heavy oak desk and clicked on the small brass architect's desk lamp. I settled into my leather chair and sat there looking at the phone on the edge of the desk. They thought they had won. They believed they had successfully reduced me to a ghost, haunting the lower level of my own home. But as I reached out and picked up the receiver, I understood the actual truth. They hadn't won a thing. They had simply brought their own end date forward. I dialed the direct private number for Burton, my estate attorney, and listened to the line ring. It was time to begin the controlled demolition. The glass of ice water sat on the table, condensing in the warm kitchen air. I reached for it slowly with deliberate control. My fingers closed around the cold, damp surface. I raised it to my lips and took a long, unhurried sip. The icy water moved down my throat, cooling the fire that had been working its way through my chest. A less disciplined man, an emotional man, would have set that glass down hard. Would have gone red in the face, voice climbing, making declarations about respect and property rights and basic decency. Would have demanded some acknowledgement of the roof above their heads. But raising your voice means you've lost control. It signals to your opponent that they've found the crack in your armor. I am not that kind of man. I am an engineer. I know how to absorb enormous pressure without showing a single fracture on the surface. I set the glass back onto the table without a sound. I looked at the multi-page grocery list sitting near my plate. I picked it up, folded it along its creases, and slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt. I looked across the table at the woman who had colonized my home and the son who had held the door open for her. I let my face go easy. I softened around the eyes. I drew my lips into a warm, agreeable, entirely manufactured smile, a smile of complete surrender, or so it appeared. I understand, Melissa, I said, keeping my voice gentle and accommodating. You're right. Your parents shouldn't have to find their way down a dark hallway at night. The master suite is the most sensible arrangement for their comfort. I'll start moving my personal belongings out tomorrow morning, so the room is ready and immaculate when they arrive. The pull-out in the basement will do me just fine. It gives everyone the room they need for a proper family Christmas. And I'll take care of this shopping list. You focus on the decorations and getting the house ready for your family. The shift in their body language was immediate, and it was pitiful to watch. Melissa released a long, theatrical exhale of relief, her rigid posture softening as she sank back into her chair. A smug, triumphant glow settled over her face. She looked at me, not with a trace of gratitude, but with the condescending approval a master extends to a well-behaved dog. She was utterly convinced she had won the war. She believed that her relentless force of will and bottomless entitlement had finally broken the stubborn old man down and converted him into a docile, cooperative butler. Beside her, Derek visibly deflated into his chair. The nervous tension drained from his frame, and he gave me a limp, cowardly grin. "Thanks, Dad," he mumbled, pushing his empty plate aside. "We really appreciate it. It's just going to make the holidays so much less stressful for everyone." They had miscalculated the situation entirely. They mistook my silence for weakness. They took my compliance as proof that I had surrendered my dignity and accepted my new station at the bottom of the household. What they failed to grasp was that a man who spent 40 years calculating the precise breaking point of steel beams and concrete pillars does not simply buckle under the weight of an entitled daughter-in-law. He redistributes the load, he reinforces his own foundation, and then he quietly pulls the supports out from under the opposing structure. They imagined themselves as brilliant tacticians seizing my territory room by room, but they were just two arrogant squatters dancing blindly over a trap door I was about to open. I rose from the table, lifted my empty dinner plate, and carried it to the sink. I cleaned it under the running water while listening to Melissa already chattering at Derek about ordering matching silk pajamas for her sisters and nephews. She was already mapping out how to rearrange the heavy antique furniture in my bedroom to better suit her parents' modern tastes. I dried my hands on a cotton towel, folded it, and draped it over the oven handle. "Have a good evening, you two," I said quietly, without bothering to turn and face them. I left the kitchen and made my way down the long, dim hallway toward my private study. The house was still in this wing, insulated from the obnoxious background noise of Melissa cataloging her holiday grievances. I passed the framed photographs lining the walls. Lorraine beaming on our back porch. A young Derek pedaling a wooden bicycle I had built for him with my own two hands. A family that no longer existed outside of fading ink and glossy paper. I did not feel grief looking at them. I felt a profound, crystalline clarity. I reached the heavy, solid oak door of my study, the one room in the entire house where Melissa was strictly forbidden, and she knew I kept it locked without exception. I drew the heavy brass key from my pocket, fitted it into the lock, and turned it deliberately. The satisfying mechanical click of the tumbler engaging was the only sound in the corridor. I stepped inside, pushed the door firmly closed behind me, and locked it from within. The study was cool and carried a faint scent of old paper cedar and leather. I crossed to my large mahogany desk and switched on the brass architect's desk lamp. A warm pool of yellow light spread across the polished surface, falling over the tidy stacks of engineering blueprints and financial ledgers. Centered on the desk, right where I always kept it, sat my leather-bound checkbook. Normally, when confronted with an unexpected expense or yet another crisis of Derek's making, I would drop heavily into that chair, open the book, and write a substantial check to make the problem vanish. I had done it for his out-of-state college tuition. I had done it for his first car after he destroyed his starter vehicle. I had done it for his extravagant destination wedding to Melissa. That checkbook was the physical symbol of 40 years of paternal patience, pushed well past its limits. I stood there looking down at the worn leather cover. My hand drifted over it for just a fraction of a second, the ghost of an old habit urging me to simply buy the groceries and keep the peace for one more holiday season. Then I drew my hand back slowly and closed my fingers into a fist. I was finished writing checks. I was finished funding my own humiliation and bankrolling my own disrespect. I walked past the checkbook and left it sitting untouched in the pool of lamplight. Instead, I reached for the heavy black rotary telephone on the far corner of the desk. I didn't need the address book. I had the number committed to memory for over 20 years. It was Burton's direct private line. Burton was not a warm family friend. He was not the type of man who offered comfort or a listening ear. He was my estate attorney, and he was arguably the most ruthless corporate lawyer in the state of Indiana. Burton specialized in high-net-worth asset protection, ironclad blind trusts, and brutal property severances. A cold, calculating shark in a custom-tailored suit, and he had spent the last 3 years advising me repeatedly to sever Derek financially before they bled me to nothing. I had always pushed back, telling Burton that Derek just needed a little more time to find his footing and grow up. But time had officially expired. I lifted the heavy receiver and dialed the number, listening to the mechanical whir of the rotary dial spinning back into place after each digit. The line rang twice before a sharp, gravelly voice cut through the static. "Burton speaking," the voice barked. I drew a slow breath, feeling the cold, clinical precision of an engineer preparing to detonate a condemned structure. "Burton, it's Gerald," I said, my voice settling into a low-level pitch that carried clearly through the quiet room. "You were right about the boy. I need you to draft the severances immediately. We're tearing the whole thing down." The heavy brass key was cold in my pocket as I turned back to my desk. I had just sat down on the phone with Burton, and the silence in the study felt absolute, the particular quiet that settles after a significant decision has been made and cannot be unmade. I felt no guilt, no hesitation. I pulled my reading glasses from my shirt pocket and sat down in front of the computer. The screen brightened, casting a pale blue glow across the mahogany. I opened my browser and navigated to my primary banking institution's portal. For more than a decade, I had managed my finances with the same precision I brought to designing steel support columns. Every dollar tracked, every expenditure justified. But over the past 3 years, I had allowed a serious structural leak to develop in my own financial foundation. That leak had a name: Derek and his wife, Melissa. Tonight, I was sealing it for good. I entered my master password and watched the dashboard populate. A long list of checking and savings accounts filled the screen. My eyes went directly to the joint checking account I had opened for Derek when he graduated from college, meant at the time as a transitional tool to cover his first apartment and a reliable vehicle, a temporary bridge to adulthood. Instead, it had become a permanent crutch. I pulled up the account details and scrolled through the recent transaction history. It was a dismal record of an overgrown boy refusing to carry his own weight. Expensive dinners at downtown steakhouses, monthly subscriptions to luxury grooming boxes, and premium car wash services for a leased vehicle he had no business owning. He treated this account as a personal slush fund, confident I would top it up automatically before it overdrew. Every dollar in those accounts stood for hours of my life. The long nights spent drafting structural blueprints, the early mornings driving to job sites in freezing rain. It represented the vacations Lorraine and I had quietly foregone so we could build something solid for our family's future. I was not about to let a spoiled woman and a spineless boy squander that legacy on vanity purchases. The money was mine, and I was reclaiming it. I moved my cursor to the Account Management tab. A security prompt appeared, asking whether I was certain I wanted to remove an authorized user. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I clicked Confirm, just like that Derek was cut off from the primary wealth I had spent a lifetime assembling. I repeated the process for the backup savings account and the shared emergency fund. I revoked his transfer privileges. I changed the routing passwords. With a handful of quiet mouse clicks, I dissolved the invisible safety net that had been catching my son every single time he decided to jump without a parachute. He was now financially on his own, entirely unsupported and fully exposed. There was an odd liberation in what I had just done. For years I'd carried his financial deadweight on my back, convincing myself that a good father always provides. But a good father also knows that you don't keep feeding poison to a patient who's already sick. Easy money was that poison. It had arrested Derek's development entirely, and now I was shutting off the tap. With Derek neutralized, I turned my focus to a far more parasitic problem. I opened a fresh tab and signed into my premium credit card portal. When Melissa and Derek first moved in under the pretense of getting their finances under control, Melissa had sweetly asked for a supplementary card. She framed it as purely practical household groceries, cleaning supplies, nothing extravagant. She said it was simpler than coming to me for cash every time she needed milk or laundry detergent at the supermarket. Playing the generous host, I agreed and had a card issued with her name beneath my primary account. I'd set a very comfortable limit on it, fully expecting her to behave like a grown adult. When I clicked into the transaction history tied to her card, a cold smile crept across my face. Melissa held a remarkably creative interpretation of household groceries. The statement read like a catalog of vanity and unchecked indulgence. Expensive nail salons, premium skincare boutiques, upscale department stores, one after another. Just last week, Melissa charged over $450 at a designer shoe outlet. Earlier that same month, a staggering bill appeared from a luxury day spa, where she had apparently treated herself and a friend to an entire afternoon of massages and facials. I scrolled through page after page of it. She was running my credit line to bankroll the lifestyle she was performing for her social media followers. Clearly, she assumed I paid the lump sum at month's end without ever glancing at the individual line items. She had me pegged as a dim old man who couldn't navigate a digital banking statement. She was spectacularly mistaken. I studied her spending patterns with care, noting which days and times she typically set out on her shopping runs. My cursor hovered over the button to freeze and cancel the supplementary card on the spot. But an engineer never drops the wrecking ball before charting exactly where the rubble needs to land. Cancel the card tonight, and she'd have a notification in her inbox by morning. She'd have time to regroup, time to confront me, time to plot some new avenue for extracting money from her husband. She'd simply commandeer Derek's card, or she'd manufacture a scene and demand I restore her privileges before her relatives descended on the house. I wanted her to feel the full, unmitigated weight of her financial reality in the most public setting imaginable. I wanted the floor to give way at the precise moment she was resting all her weight on it. I backed out of the cancellation button and opened the advanced security settings. That premium card came with a detailed suite of controls for managing supplementary users, the kind of feature designed for wealthy parents reining in dependent children, though it suited my present purpose just as well. I configured a very targeted restriction. The system would automatically decline any single transaction over $50. Then I set a complete hard cancellation of the physical card to execute in exactly 48 hours, timed to land right in the middle of the grand holiday grocery run she had described to me. I knew precisely how Melissa operated. She'd put it off until the last possible moment, then swoop into the most exclusive market in town and load a cart with imported cheeses, dry-aged ribeye roasts, and expensive champagne, fully expecting my card to absorb the damage at the register. By setting the cancellation on a delay, I was guaranteeing that her humiliation would be complete and inescapable. The card would be declined while she stood in a long queue of affluent holiday shoppers. She'd have to reach for her own credit cards, the ones carrying punishing interest rates and bloated balances. She would have to drain her own accounts to feed the 30 relatives she had so graciously invited into my home. I leaned back in my leather chair and took in the quiet hum of the computer. The glowing screen threw long shadows across the bookshelves, the only light left in the room. I had just dismantled their entire financial structure. No raised voice, no slammed door, no warning of any kind. I had pulled the pillars, the beams, and the foundation out from under them. The only thing holding their lives upright at that moment was the sheer momentum of their own ignorance. They were sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware that their luxury existence had just been switched off. The invisible scaffolding of their false reality was gone. I shut the laptop, folded my reading glasses, and switched off the brass architect's desk lamp. The study went completely dark, and yet I had never seen the path ahead with such clarity. Tomorrow, the physical extraction would begin. I would start boxing up my life, carefully packing away the things that carried Lorraine's memory, and readying myself to leave for good. I sat in the dark a few minutes longer, letting the silence settle over me. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a deep, genuine peace. I was no longer a man being quietly robbed inside his own home. I was the architect of their approaching ruin. The next morning, pale light struggled through heavy gray clouds as I watched Derek and Melissa back out of the driveway. Their silver luxury SUV crunched across the frost-stiffened gravel and disappeared down the street. The instant the taillights vanished, I locked the front door. A deep, familiar quiet settled over the house. For 3 years, I had spent my days dodging their chaos, retreating to the study or the garden. But today, my role had fundamentally shifted. I was no longer a retired engineer marking time in his old house. I was a man executing a meticulous, deliberate extraction. I had exactly 3 weeks until the holiday invasion, and I intended to use every hour of them. I started in the master bedroom, the sanctuary Melissa had so casually demanded I vacate. Standing in the center of it, I looked at the life Lorraine and I had assembled together over decades. For most people, dismantling 40 years of shared memories would be an emotional ordeal, crying over old photo albums, clinging to keepsakes. But I had done my grieving for Lorraine 7 years ago. I knew she wasn't residing in the walls of this house. She wasn't in the hardwood floors or the vaulted ceilings. Her memory lived inside me. The objects we'd gathered were simply possessions, but they were my possessions, and I was not about to let a group of entitled strangers abuse them. I pulled out a stack of heavy-duty moving boxes I had stored in the back of the closet. I began with the valuables. Lorraine had assembled a beautiful collection of antique jewelry and delicate porcelain figurines sourced from estate sales all across the country. I wrapped every piece in thick layers of bubble wrap, and packed them snugly so nothing would shift in transit. I moved to the walls next, taking down the original oil paintings we had bought on our 10th anniversary trip to the coast. I cleared out the safe in my study, moving the deeds, birth certificates, bonds, and every irreplaceable family document into a secure, locked briefcase. An operation of this scale demanded absolute secrecy. If Melissa came home to bare walls and empty shelves, she'd know something was wrong immediately. She'd create a scene, demand explanations, and potentially try to lay claim to my belongings as household property. So I approached it the way an engineer approaches structural illusion. As long as the facade holds, people rarely stop to examine what's underneath. Over the following days, I made several trips to thrift stores and discount shops on the far side of town. I picked up terrible generic landscape prints in flimsy plastic frames. I bought mass-produced ceramic vases and cheap glass bowls. Every time I lifted one of Lorraine's oil paintings from the wall, I immediately hung a worthless discount print in its place. When I packed away her heavy silver tea set, a polished tin imitation shiny enough at a distance took its spot. I staged the decoys with absolute precision, preserving the general look and feel of each room. The illusion was executed without a single flaw. Melissa was a profoundly superficial woman. She skimmed the surface of everything, never bothering to look any deeper. She walked past the counterfeit paintings and the cheap ceramic vases every single evening, completely blind to the fact that the real treasures had been quietly moved out. She was too absorbed in her phone and her complaints about co-workers to register that the soul of the house was being steadily hollowed out. My daily operation ran on a strict schedule. I worked from 8:00 in the morning straight through to 3:00 in the afternoon, packing and swapping. At 3:30, I loaded the sealed boxes into my sedan's trunk and drove across town to a high-end, climate-controlled storage facility where I'd rented a large, secure unit under a corporate alias. The facility ran dual passcode entry and biometric scanning. Nobody was ever going to trace my assets through that door. I stacked the boxes inside the metal unit with the kind of mathematical efficiency I'd applied to job sites for 4 decades. Every trip felt like carrying another piece of my freedom across the finish line. By the second week, the house was essentially a hollow shell. The heavy oak furniture was still in place, but every drawer was bare. The closets held only the clothes I needed to get through the next 2 weeks. Everything else, my winter coats, my formal suits, my vintage watch collection, was sitting dry and secure in the storage unit. The physical weight of that house lifted a little more with each passing day. One Tuesday afternoon, I was taping up a mid-sized box in the living room when the front door swung open without warning. Melissa had decided to leave her part-time job early. I didn't panic. I didn't scramble to hide the packing tape. I simply straightened up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and held a calm, unhurried posture. She came into the living room, heels clicking against the floor. She stopped, dropped her expensive handbag onto an armchair, and eyed the cardboard box sitting at my feet. One eyebrow went up. Her hands found her hips. I gave her a polite, slightly tired smile and told her I was just getting a head start on clearing out some of the old clutter before her parents arrived. Wanted to make sure they'd have plenty of room in the closets and that the house felt open and welcoming for the holidays. The suspicion drained right off her face and was replaced by a wide, self-satisfied grin. She actually clapped her hands together, delighted by what she took as my surrender. She told me that was a fantastic idea and that she'd been meaning to say the place felt too cramped with all this old junk. She praised me for finally showing some initiative and making things presentable for her family. She even suggested I clear the books out of the hallway because her mother couldn't stand the smell of old paper. I nodded and told her I'd get right on it. I watched her climb the stairs, humming to herself, entirely pleased with her grip on my life. She genuinely believed I was dismantling my own history to accommodate her mother's preferences. It took real effort not to laugh out loud in that empty room. She had handed me the perfect cover story without a moment's hesitation. My covert extraction was no longer a clandestine operation. It was an officially sanctioned household chore. The final week of packing was nearly effortless. With Melissa's explicit blessing to remove clutter, I no longer needed to conceal the boxes at all. I walked them right out the front door in broad daylight. I cleared out my entire workshop in the garage, leaving behind only a few rusted screwdrivers and some empty paint cans. I emptied the kitchen cabinets of the good crystal and the quality silverware, leaving only the cheap, everyday plates and mismatched cutlery. If 30 people were going to pour into this house, they could eat off generic ceramic and drink from plain glass. I was not leaving a single item of value for them to scratch, chip, or pocket. On the final run to the storage unit, I stood before the rolling metal door and looked at the neatly stacked columns of my life. 40 years of hard work, of marriage, of raising a son, all safely contained within those corrugated cardboard walls. The unit was cool, dry, and precisely ordered. I pulled the heavy door down and locked it with a thick steel padlock. Driving back that evening, the house looked completely unchanged from the street. The brick facade was solid. The lawn was tidy. But the moment I stepped through the front door into the foyer, the air felt different. The acoustics had shifted. There was a faint hollowness to the sound, a subtle echo born of everything I had quietly removed. It was no longer a home. It was just a structure, a perfectly staged film set, waiting for the final act of a disaster picture to play out. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The trap was set, the valuables were secure, and the foundation had been completely severed. All that remained was to wait for the occupants to pull the final lever themselves. The steakhouse downtown was exactly the kind of establishment Derek and Melissa would post pictures of online, but could never actually afford. The lighting was extremely low, throwing long shadows across the dark mahogany-paneled walls and the heavy leather booths. The air carried the scent of aged beef, roasted garlic, and very expensive scotch. It was the sort of place where quiet conversations moved millions of dollars across the table before the appetizers arrived. I handed my coat to the host and made my way toward the private corner booth where Burton was already waiting. Burton did not look like a man who spent his days filing paperwork. He looked like a predator at rest, wearing a tailored Italian suit. He had a glass of neat bourbon in one hand and a thick manila folder on the table in front of him. He didn't smile when I sat down. Burton and I had long since moved past pleasantries. We respected one another because we both operated on logic and precise execution, nothing else. I ordered water and a bone-in New York strip. I wasn't drinking. I needed my mind running with absolute clarity. Burton took a slow sip and tapped one manicured finger against the folder. He fixed me with those sharp gray eyes of his. "You know, Gerald," he said, his voice low and graveled, "I have been your attorney for a very long time. I have watched you build your wealth, and I have watched you protect your family. But I must admit I was beginning to think you would never actually make this call. I was starting to believe you were going to let that boy bleed you entirely dry." I unfolded my linen napkin and placed it across my lap. "Burton, a structural collapse is entirely a matter of timing," I replied. "Detonate the charges too early and the building falls the wrong direction, damages everything around it. You have to wait until the internal load is perfectly balanced before you pull the final pin." Burton let out a short, sharp bark of laughter. He liked the metaphor. He pushed the manila folder across the polished table toward me. "Then let's talk about the load," he said. For the past 5 years, a luxury commercial real estate developer had been relentlessly pursuing my property. They had sent letters they had called Burton's office, and they had made increasingly desperate cash offers. My double lot sat at the precise intersection they needed to complete a massive zoning block. Their plan was to raze my house and build an exclusive boutique condominium complex aimed at wealthy retirees. I had known this was coming. Every few months, a glossy envelope would appear in my mailbox, dangling an astronomical figure in exchange for vacating the premises. I had thrown every one of those letters directly into the fireplace. I had always instructed Burton to reject their offers without even looking at the numbers. To me, that property was never a financial asset. It was the physical embodiment of my life with Lorraine, the garden she planted, the patio we built together. Sacred ground. But sitting in the dim warmth of that steakhouse, something shifted in my thinking. The sacred ground had been desecrated by contempt. The garden was just dirt. The patio was just concrete. Lorraine wasn't there anymore. The only things left in that house were 2 greedy squatters and a coming wave of 30 arrogant strangers. I opened the folder. The contract was dense with legal language that would have bewildered most people. But I had spent 40 years parsing municipal building codes and union contracts. I understood exactly what I was reading. The developer was offering millions of dollars in a clean cash transaction. No financing contingencies, no structural inspections required, because they planned to bulldoze the whole structure to the ground regardless. It was the cleanest, most lucrative exit a man could ask for. I worked through the standard clauses, taking note of the purchase price. It was enough to buy a luxury penthouse anywhere in the world and still have millions remaining to generate compounding returns. But the money was really just an agreeable side effect. The true value of this contract was the absolute total destruction of Melissa and Derek's fabricated reality. I turned to the second section of the document where the dates and transfer logistics were laid out. This was the critical junction. I looked up at Burton. "The financial terms are acceptable," I said, keeping my voice entirely level. "There is one condition, however. The handover timeline needs to change. I have precise requirements for how this transfer unfolds." Burton shifted forward, planting his forearms on the table. "State them," he said. "This developer wants that parcel badly enough that they'll bend to almost any demand you put in front of them." "December 26th is the closing date I require," I said. "Legal ownership stays with me through the Christmas holiday itself. The instant midnight arrives on the 26th, though title passes to their corporate holding company, full and unconditional possession of the structure and the land." Burton's eyes narrowed as he turned the date over in his mind. He understood immediately what that date meant. He knew Melissa had filled the house with her entire extended family for the holiday week. A slow smile, the dangerous kind, settled across his face. "Done," he said quietly, scratching a note on his legal pad. "What else?" "The utilities, and this is the load-bearing piece." I held his gaze. "I want my name stripped from the water, the gas, and the electricity accounts. All 3 closed out and handed over to the developer's corporate management arm on the morning of December 23rd. The contract needs to specify clearly that the developer carries full responsibility for those accounts starting 3 days before the property changes hands." Burton's pen stopped moving. He set it down and studied me with an expression caught somewhere between professional admiration and outright disbelief. "Gerald," he said, his voice dropping, "if those utilities transfer to a commercial demolition outfit on the 23rd, the heat is not staying on. Standard protocol for a structure flagged for demolition is an immediate hard shut-off gas and power, both cut to eliminate any liability ahead of the wrecking crew. You'd be leaving those people in the dead of an Indiana winter with no heat whatsoever." I lifted the heavy silver pen from beside the contract and turned it slowly in my hand. the cold metal pressing against my fingers. "Burton, I've spent a career studying how demolition operations work," I answered, my voice carrying no warmth at all. "I'm not doing anything to them. I'm withdrawing my own support, nothing more. If hosting 30 guests for a luxury holiday matters so much to them, they're perfectly free to sort out the heating arrangements themselves. I won't be anywhere near that house." Burton exhaled through his teeth in a low whistle. The elegance of it clearly impressed him. Shifting those utility accounts into the hands of a faceless demolition company meant my fingerprints vanished from the whole affair. The moment the warmth bled out and the pipes locked up, Melissa and Derek would pick up the phone and find themselves talking to people who didn't know them and didn't care. The accounts weren't in their names. The property wasn't theirs. There was no lever they could pull and no number they could call to reverse it. 30 angry relatives, a dark house, no heat, and not a single legal avenue open to them. They would finally have to stand inside the truth of their position. They possessed nothing here. They had authority over nothing. They were long overstayed houseguests who had mistaken my tolerance for ownership. I pressed the top of the pen and turned to the back page where the signature blocks sat waiting. Not a moment of hesitation, not a whisper of sentiment or second thought. I touched the pen to the page and drew my name across the line, deliberate, unhurried, certain. I initialed every writer. I signed every transfer authorization. Each stroke of ink cut another cord, binding me to the arrangement I had quietly endured for far too long. Our stakes came out not long after the last page was signed. The waiter set the plates down, sizzling fragrant with rosemary and butter, and we settled into an easy, wordless meal together. There was nothing left to strategize. The mechanism was built, loaded, and running. Burton collected the executed documents once we'd finished tucking them into his briefcase with practiced care. He raised his glass of bourbon across the table toward me in a measured, unhurried toast. "Doing business with you has always been a privilege, Gerald," he said. "The developer will be very pleased. Utilities transfer on the 23rd exactly as written. The property manager comes through on the 24th for a final structural check before demolition goes on the schedule." I pressed the napkin to my mouth and set it aside. Already running the picture in my head, the property manager on Christmas Eve, arriving with a clipboard and an expectation of an empty building, finding, instead, Melissa, Derek, and 30 shivering strangers sitting in the cold and the dark. The whole counterfeit empire finally caving in on itself. I got up from the booth and left enough cash on the table for the meal and a tip worth remembering. "Thank you, Burton," I said, working the buttons on my coat. "I have a flight to Park City booked in a few weeks, and one last grocery list I intend to do absolutely nothing about." December 20th came in hard, a sharp, gnawing wind that worked at the window frames and promised serious snow by evening. The sky outside had gone the color of old concrete, flat and pitiless. The inside of the house told a completely different story. The energy in there was frantic, almost feverish humming with tension, the way a live wire hums before it snaps. Melissa had shifted into a mode that had nothing to do with holiday hospitality. She was running the place like a commander bracing for an assault. Her people, 30 of the most self-important, high-maintenance individuals I'd ever encountered under one roof, were descending in 48 hours, and the countdown had converted my once quiet home into something resembling a campaign headquarters on the eve of battle. I settled into my leather armchair near the fireplace, watching the whole spectacle with the calm remove of someone who already knows how the film ends. Melissa moved in tight, agitated loops across the living room, a tablet in one hand, a clipboard in the other, firing instructions at Derek, who darted from room to room like a man trying to avoid getting stepped on. He was lugging boxes of Christmas decorations up from the basement, drenched in sweat, wearing the face of a man who had made at least one very consequential mistake in his life. He caught a door frame wrong, and a box of glass ornaments hit the floor, and Melissa turned on him with a sharpness that briefly stirred something like sympathy in me. That feeling lasted about 3 seconds. He'd built this. Every choice had led here, and he'd made them all freely. The need to project a perfect image had consumed her completely by this point. The day before, she'd commissioned a full professional cleaning crew, charging it to the supplementary card she still believed was fully operational, to go through every room of the house. Fresh floral arrangements had been ordered for every flat surface. She was burning herself out, manufacturing an image, prosperity, elegance, domestic mastery, all of it a stage set. She needed her mother, her father, her brothers and sisters to come through that door and see a woman who had arrived. I sat and watched her build it, saying nothing. I knew the ground she was building on had already been pulled out from under her. The card she kept reaching for had been quietly capped. The house she was staging wasn't mine anymore, which meant it certainly wasn't hers. The furnace she was counting on to keep her guests from complaining was 3 days from a permanent corporate shutoff. She was laying a banquet table on the deck of a sinking vessel. Shortly before noon, Melissa's circuits finally registered that I was sitting by the fire. She broke off whatever she was doing and crossed the room straight toward me, face-red eyes, carrying that bright, pressurized look she got when something was required of her and hadn't happened yet. No greeting, no pleasantry. She thrust a thick folded sheet toward me, heavy enough that the ink showed through the back. Took updated grocery list, final version. She announced her words, coming fast and clipped. I went over it again with my mother last night. She's now requesting a specific imported smoked salmon for the Christmas Eve spread, and my uncle won't drink anything except one particular brand of artisanal gin. You need to go today, not tomorrow. By the weekend, the good shelves will be completely bare, and I will not have my family sitting down to whatever the discount aisle has left over. I looked at that folded paper. Through it, I could make out the packed rows of her handwriting, line after line. It was a demand letter dressed up as a grocery list. It was proof in ink that she viewed me as nothing more than a funding mechanism for her self-presentation. 7 days ago, that piece of paper would have tightened my jaw. A month back, it would have sparked a real confrontation. Sitting there now, all I felt was a clean, uncomplicated amusement, almost affectionate in its distance. A laugh moved up from somewhere in my chest, and I pressed it back down. I reached over unhurriedly and lifted the list from her fingers. I didn't bother unfolding it to read the new additions. Whatever extravagant items she'd tacked on overnight were entirely beside the point. I kept my expression completely neutral, the deep satisfaction running beneath the surface well hidden. "Of course, Melissa," I said, my voice smooth and accommodating. "You're carrying an enormous amount right now with everyone arriving so soon. I'll handle the shopping this afternoon, put it out of your mind entirely." She expelled a long, theatrical breath, eyes drifting toward the ceiling, as though my willingness to help was the barest floor of what she expected from me. "Make sure you check the dates on the dairy," she said, already rotating away. "Last time you bought cream for my coffee, it was expiring in 3 days. My mother scrutinizes everything. I cannot have her finding fault with the food. And tell the butcher to double wrap the meat. I won't have blood running all over the inside of the refrigerator before tomorrow." I watched her stride off, already firing another sharp command at Derek, who was crouched on the floor, wrestling with a massive snarl of outdoor lights. I glanced down at the heavy paper in my grip. I ran my thumb along its crisp edge, feeling the premium stock she'd chosen to print her demands on. I folded it in half, then in half again, pressing it into a neat little square, and tucked it into my trouser pocket. Then I rose from my chair, brushing nothing in particular from my knee. I moved to the hallway closet, pulled out my heavy winter coat, and worked the buttons up against the cold. I took my car keys from the small wooden bowl on the entryway table. From the living room, Melissa's voice called out the moment she heard the keys jangle something about extra bags of ice. I didn't reply. I pushed open the front door and walked out into the bitter Indiana air. The cold caught my face, but inside, I was anything but cold. I crossed the driveway to my sedan. I had no intention of visiting any high-end grocery store. Smoked salmon and artisanal gin were of no concern to me whatsoever. My afternoon belonged to a bank withdrawal for travel cash and a long, unhurried lunch at a quiet diner on the other side of town. I got behind the wheel, fired the engine, and dialed the heater up. The final clock had started running, and I planned to relish every tick of it. I came back to the house in the late afternoon, just as the winter light gave out, and long gray shadows crawled across the frozen front yard. A few quiet hours well spent on a good meal and my travel arrangements. When I let myself back in the house, still buzzed with the same feverish, unhinged energy Melissa had been generating all week. The air was thick with artificial pine. I said nothing to anyone. I went straight upstairs to my study, leaving them to their frantic preparations below. In the study, I retrieved the one item I had set aside specifically for this moment. It was a sleek, vintage canvas suitcase purchased years ago for a trip Lorraine and I took to Europe. Solid, timeless, exactly right for a winter getaway. I laid it open and packed the last of my essentials, a few clothing items, my shaving kit, a handful of personal things. I pressed the brass locks shut. The snap they made in that quiet room sounded very much like punctuation. I pulled on my heavy wool coat, wound my scarf into place, and lifted the suitcase by its handle. Ready. I stepped out of the study and started toward the top of the main staircase. Down in the foyer, the scene was pure chaos. Melissa stood near the entryway, death gripping her clipboard, hammering her pen against its metal clip. Derek was balanced on the middle rung of a stepladder, making a clumsy attempt to drape a thick, artificial garland across the front door frame. They were snapping at each other over the lights, both completely sealed inside their small, frantic world. I put my foot on the first step. The solid sound of my shoe against the wood and the quiet creak of the boards brought the argument to an immediate stop. Derek twisted on the ladder, one hand still clutching a rung. Melissa's pen went still. Her eyes moved from my coat to the suitcase in my hand, and for a moment her face went genuinely blank, the look of a system encountering data it has no category for. "Where exactly are you going?" she said, the irritation arriving quickly to replace the confusion. "And where are the groceries you were supposed to be at the butcher hours ago? Why is there a suitcase? Are you bringing old blankets up from this basement for the cousins?" I came off the last step onto the marble foyer floor. I left the suitcase exactly where it was in my hand and held myself straight, looking at her without any particular expression. I let the silence sit for a few seconds and do its work. Then I looked over at Derek, white-knuckling the ladder sides, and back to Melissa. I let a genuine smile settle across my face, the specific kind that belongs to a man who has just finished a complicated, difficult job and is walking away from the site for the last time. "Your family arrives in exactly 48 hours. I said, each word measured and unhurried. 30 people. I think that's genuinely wonderful. Perfect, actually." Melissa's grip on the clipboard visibly tightened. "What does that mean? Where is the food, Gerald?" I adjusted my hold on the suitcase handle. "I'm taking a vacation to Park City," I said, letting each syllable fall clearly into the foyer. "You're welcome to cook for your guests. I'm not the household staff." The effect was immediate and everything I had anticipated. The color left Melissa's face all at once. Her mouth came open and nothing came out. The clipboard dropped slightly in her loosening hand. She stood staring at me the way a person stares at something that simply shouldn't be happening. Her version of reality was visibly coming apart at the seams. Park City. The word finally surfaced, small and shaky. What do you mean, Park City? What about the groceries? What about my parents? The master suite, you said you were moving to the basement. What, the master suite is entirely yours to manage, I said pleasantly. As for the list you hand me, it's still sitting in my pocket right where you put it. I'd get moving toward the store if I were you. Premium cuts go fast this time of year, and the shelves are going to be stripped bare by tomorrow. Derek nearly came off the ladder. He scrambled down the rungs, face flushed and urgent, moving toward me with both hands half raised. Dad, hold on. You can't do this. We have 30 people showing up. We can't run all of this by ourselves. You have to be here. We need you. What you need, Derek, I said, meeting my son's eyes with the steady calm of a man who has already made every calculation, is a catering service and a cleaning crew. I am neither. I'm a man who has earned a ski trip and I'm taking it. Before Derek could pull together another appeal, a wash of headlights swept across the frosted glass panels flanking the front door. The crunch of tires on frozen gravel, my town car right on the minute. I had arranged a private car to take me straight to the airport, and the driver was exactly on time. I turned from the two of them, took the brass handle of the front door, and swung it open. A blade of freezing air cut into the warm foyer. Outside, the sleek black car sat idling, exhaust rising in soft curls against the cold evening sky. The driver was already out and standing at the open rear door. I didn't look back. No parting monologue, no final flourish. I stepped over the threshold, the suitcase rolling behind me. What you are about to hear is the moment everything Gerald had been quietly building toward finally moves, and there is no going back from it. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If someone you loved and provided for had been working against you all along, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait and let your actions do the talking? The heavy front door swung shut behind me with a deep, solid thud, leaving Derek and Melissa motionless in the foyer, surrounded by half-hung tinsel and the dawning weight of their own helplessness. I settled into the heated rear seat of the town car, told the driver to head for the airport, and watched the house shrink away in the window, feeling nothing except the vast, clean quiet of a man who has finally put something down. The leather seat was warm against my back as the car moved smoothly down the iced-over highway. I sat in the unhurried stillness of the back seat, watching bare-limbed trees streak past the tinted glass. After a moment, I pulled out my phone. Not to read holiday messages or check the news. I opened the banking app. I had a very precise picture of what was unfolding back at my old address. The mechanism I'd built so carefully was just about to engage. Melissa had been herded into a corner of her own construction. With 30 imperious relatives bearing down in under 48 hours and not a single thing in the pantry, she had no room to maneuver. She couldn't wait on Derek to handle it. She had to bundle up and march herself into that upscale grocery store to work through her enormous list. I could see it without any effort at all. She would have blown through the sliding entrance doors, commandeered 3 carts, and snapped at some teenage stockboy to help push them. She'd have cut through the crowded aisles like a woman on a military operation, heaping those carts with the oversized, dry-aged ribeye roasts, the imported French camembert, the pricey vintage champagne, and the artisanal gin her uncle demanded. She would have moved through that store the way royalty moves, plucking things off shelves without a glance at what anything cost, fully confident my accounts were absorbing every dollar. I pushed back into the seat and kept my eyes on the glowing phone screen. At exactly 6:45 in the evening, The first alert arrived, a sharp red notification from the credit card company. An attempted charge of $250 at the downtown premium grocer. And directly beneath the total, the single word I had been waiting for. Declined. A soft laugh came out of me, quiet in the warm car cabin. The scene playing out at that checkout lane was entirely legible to me. The cashier would have rung up that tower of luxury groceries item by item while the number on the display climbed and climbed. Melissa would have been inspecting her nails or scrolling her phone, utterly unbothered. When the total was called out, she'd have produced my supplementary card with the casual confidence of someone who has never once doubted a payment. The machine would have beeped once hard and rejected it. I know Melissa. I know exactly what that pride of hers does in a moment like that. She would not have flushed or apologized. She would have told the cashier calmly, condescendingly, that the terminal was clearly malfunctioning and asked them to run it again. My phone buzzed a second time. Same charge, same answer, declined. I could feel the panic taking root in her chest from 100 miles away. The line behind her prosperous, impatient holiday shoppers would have been shifting their weight-trading glances, checking the time. Every second she stood, the polished image she'd spent years engineering was fracturing in front of an audience. The cashier would have returned the card and asked for another form of payment. She couldn't walk away. Abandoning 3 heaped carts of custom butchery and imported cheese in full view of people she might know, that would be a wound she'd never recover from. There was only one exit. She'd have had to reach into her own designer wallet and start producing her personal cards. The ones she kept out of sight. The ones carrying 24% interest and balances that were already in dangerous territory. She'd have had to swipe her own plastic and absorb that entire hit at the register right there in public. 30 minutes later, the town car pulled up to the terminal. I paid, the driver checked my bag, and walked into the exclusive airline lounge. I ordered a sparkling water, took a quiet corner chair, and set my phone on the table beside me. It immediately began vibrating in a steady, relentless rhythm. Derek calling, again and again. I didn't pick up. I watched the missed calls accumulate and eventually roll to voicemail, then I pressed play and listened. The audio was wrecked by the volume of whatever was happening behind him. Derek's voice was taut, scrambling, barely holding together. "Dad, you have to call me back right now," he said. "There's been some kind of huge banking error. Melissa just got home from the store and your card was declined. She had to put almost $5,000 on her own card, and it maxed it out completely. You need to move the money over right now. Call the bank, fix this. We don't have any way to pay this." Underneath his voice, I could make out Melissa. She was beyond hysterical. I heard the heavy thump of grocery bags hitting countertops. She was screaming at Derek, calling him useless, demanding to know how his father's bank had managed to freeze everything right on the eve of her family's arrival. She was coming apart, entirely tearing at the seams of their already fragile arrangement over a few $1,000s worth of premium beef and imported cheese. I deleted the voicemail with one tap. I didn't dial the bank. I didn't move a single cent to anyone. I switched the phone off, put it away, and sat watching the first snow begin to drift down across the runway outside the lounge window. The opening pillar of their fabricated world had given way, and they were under it. And the genuinely beautiful part, the part I savored most, was that the real catastrophe hadn't started yet. The utility shutoff was still 3 days out. I took a long, slow sip of water. The holiday season was delivering exactly what I'd planned. I had been away for exactly 48 hours. To a structural engineer, 48 hours is a precise and meaningful interval. It's the span in which an unmaintained operating system begins to show its first outward signs of breakdown. For 3 years, I had been the invisible current running through that property, keeping everything functional. I swept the hardwood floors. I wiped down the granite countertops. I hauled the trash bins out before they reached capacity. I kept the temperature regulated and the systems running. Remove that input, and the property became a rapidly degrading environment, one that Derek and Melissa had neither the discipline nor the instincts to manage. I knew the porcelain sink would already be stacked with dishes from their frantic makeshift meals. I knew the garbage bags were bloated and starting to leak because neither of them would have thought to drag the bins down the long, frozen driveway ahead of the storm. The invasion landed at exactly 3:00 in the afternoon. I knew the precise moment because my security camera app, which I had very deliberately left running on my phone while I sat in comfort at my Park City lodge, pushed an alert the instant it detected movement at the front door. I watched the silent footage from thousands of miles away over a hot cup of coffee. A fleet of rental cars and oversized family SUVs flooded my driveway, wedged in at odd angles across the frozen lawn and up onto the sidewalk. The doors opened and the wave hit. 30 people spilled out into the Indiana cold, hauling enormous rolling bags, shouting over each other, already complaining about the temperature. A turbulent mass of heavy coats and high expectations converging on my front walk. They bottlenecked at the porch steps. Melissa yanked the front door open, her face arranged into a wide, strained smile. She had on a thin designer sweater, the costume of a composed, affluent woman receiving her guests in her gracious home. But reality introduced itself immediately. 30 bodies filing through the foyer meant 60 wet, salt-caked winter boots grinding slush and grit directly into the pristine marble tiles I used to get down on my knees and mop by hand. The entryway turned into a filthy, churning bottleneck within seconds. The sheer number of bodies crowding the space overwhelmed the delicate atmosphere Melissa had spent days painstakingly constructing. Melissa had devoted her entire adult life chasing her mother's approval, a woman whose native tongue was criticism dressed up as concern. I could picture the matriarch arriving at the front door, peeling off her expensive leather gloves, and immediately scanning the entryway for imperfections. Melissa had hired a professional cleaning crew several days earlier, but 48 hours of she and Derek living in a state of barely controlled panic had undone every bit of that work. The mother would have dragged one perfectly manicured finger along the ornate oak wainscoting in the hallway, then held it up to inspect the thin film of dust already gathering there. She wouldn't raise her voice. She would simply exhale a soft, deeply disappointed sigh that could slice clean through her daughter's fragile self-image. The guest rooms were the next point of collapse. Without me there to wash the heavy winter linens, fold the towels, and arrange the pillows properly. The accommodations were badly short of acceptable. Melissa had almost certainly crammed her various relatives into spare rooms and repurposed office spaces, apologizing over and over for the disorder and probably blaming some invented household staff for taking the holiday off. I listened to the frantic voicemails Derek left me later that evening, laying out in painful detail the nightmare playing out inside my house. He whispered from behind a locked bathroom door, pleading with me to come back because Melissa was teetering on the edge of a complete breakdown. Her aunt was loudly grumbling that the cheap air mattresses were slowly deflating against the cold hardwood floors, leaving her pressed against bare wood by morning. Her younger cousins were locked in open warfare over the single shared bathroom in the East Wing, because the hot water tank had no hope of keeping pace with a dozen people showering back to back. The house simply wasn't built or plumbed to function as a high-volume hotel, and the infrastructure was buckling under the sudden crushing demand. But the single most exquisite failure of that entire evening unfolded in the formal dining room. Melissa had maxed out her credit limits at the upscale grocery store, pouring all of it into premium cuts and artisanal cheeses. What she had completely failed to account for was the sheer quantity of alcohol needed to keep 30 highly critical relatives reasonably placid through a long winter night. Her father, an arrogant, self-important man who fancied himself an amateur sommelier, had made straight for the built-in mahogany bar, fully expecting to find a well-curated spread of premium spirits. What he found instead were a few cheap bottles of generic table wine Melissa had grabbed in desperation from a corner convenience store when her funds abruptly ran dry. Derek sobbed through his voicemail, recounting the scene in agonizing detail. He described how his father-in-law lifted a bottle of $12 blended red wine, turning the cheap metal screw cap over in his hand with undisguised contempt. The man swung around to face the crowded room and asked loudly whether the logistics company Derek worked for was approaching bankruptcy because putting this kind of offensive swill in front of family was simply beneath them. He questioned openly how they could justify living in such an enormous, expensive house while failing to stock even a halfway decent liquor cabinet for the holidays. He humiliated his daughter in front of everyone assembled, peeling away the glossy, prosperous image she had worked so desperately to project over her hollow life. I sat beside the roaring fire in my ski lodge, watching heavy snow settle over the dark mountains, listening to Derek struggling to breathe on the recording. The house in Indiana was loud, overcrowded, and sliding toward unsanitary. The guests were hungry, exhausted, and merciless in their judgment. Melissa was locking herself in the kitchen pantry to cry where no one could see her, and Derek was crouched in the guest bathroom, leaving pitiful messages on the phone of the very man they'd tried to exile to a freezing, unfinished basement. The elaborate illusion of their wealth was fracturing in real time under the unrelenting scrutiny of the people they had most wanted to impress. The structural integrity of their marriage was eroding fast, and the internal pressure was only going to mount as the night wore on. The crushing weight of 30 ungrateful, demanding guests was bearing down on a foundation built entirely of lies and borrowed money. They were coming apart, and they had no one to hold responsible but themselves. And the most magnificent element of the whole situation was knowing that the true catastrophic failure, the absolute freezing termination of their fabricated reality, hadn't even arrived yet. The winter storm was only just beginning. The morning of December 23rd descended on the Indiana Valley with absolute brutality. I watched the national weather broadcast from the comfort of my luxury suite in Park City, working through a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. A massive winter system had stalled directly over the Midwest. Blinding heavy snow was falling at 2 inches an hour, and the temperature had plunged deep into the single digits. The wind chill was severe enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. It was the kind of savage, unforgiving weather that makes a solidly built, fully heated home feel like an impenetrable fortress against the elements. But my former home was no longer a fortress. By 8 o'clock that morning, it was nothing more than a large brick shell steadily bleeding its thermal mass into the frozen air. I knew the precise moment the mechanism engaged. I had structured the utility account transfers with the exacting precision of a digital timer. When the clock turned the hour, the automated systems at the regional electric and gas companies processed the completed legal transfer. My name was wiped clean from their records. The new account holder on file was a commercial demolition and development firm. Per standard corporate safety protocols, any property scheduled for imminent teardown must have all volatile utilities fully severed to prevent accidental fires or explosions. No technician needed to set foot on the property to throw a physical switch. Everything was managed remotely through the smart grid. Deep inside the walls of that house, the lifeblood of the property simply ceased. The massive forced air heating units in the basement powered down and went silent. The glowing digital thermostats along the hallways went completely dark. The pilot lights on both water heaters went out. The current running through the copper wiring faded away, leaving every outlet and overhead fixture dead. The large refrigerator packed with Melissa's thousands of dollars worth of premium meats and artisanal cheeses stopped humming. The house didn't merely lose power, it died entirely. I could map out with perfect clarity the sequence of events taking shape inside those walls. All 30 of the arrogant, demanding guests would have been asleep, taking full advantage of the holiday. But a house that size sheds heat with remarkable speed when the outside temperature sits in the single digits. The cold would have seeped in through the tall bay windows, spreading across the hardwood floors and climbing the staircases. The air inside the bedrooms would have turned sharp and biting. One by one, the relatives would have stirred, shivering, dragging thin, decorative blankets up around their chins. Someone, almost certainly the pompous father-in-law, would have stumbled out of the master suite, anticipating a hot shower and a freshly brewed cup of premium coffee. He would have twisted the brass handle on the shower and found nothing but icy water blasting from the head. He would have moved into the kitchen, snapping light switches in the hallway, and meeting nothing but thick, pressing darkness. The whole horde of guests would have spilled out of their rooms, bundled in winter coats, thrown over pajamas, demanding explanations, complaining loudly about the cold and the absence of basic amenities. Derek would have been the first target of their anger. Melissa would have screamed at him to fix it immediately so she could dry her hair and get food in front of her starving relatives. She would have assumed a blown fuse or a neighborhood outage, something simple and correctable. She would have sent him to the basement to reset the system. I knew exactly what Derek felt the moment he started down those wooden stairs into the dark, freezing concrete below. He would have used the faint flashlight on his cell phone to find his way around. He would have crossed to the main electrical panel, moving past the bare walls where my tools used to hang. He would have pulled open the metal breaker box door and swept his light across the rows of black plastic switches. He would have expected to find one flipped the wrong way, but every single switch would have been perfectly aligned. He would have toggled the main breaker off and back on, waiting for the familiar, reassuring hum of the furnace returning to life. But the basement would have stayed absolutely silent. The silence of a disconnected grid is something else entirely. It is heavy and final, and it holds no answers. Standing in the freezing dark, Derek would have understood this was no blown fuse. He would have drawn his phone from his pocket and watched the battery percentage creeping downward in the cold. He would have dialed the emergency customer service line for the regional electric company. He would have worked through the maddening automated menu system, jabbing buttons with shaking fingers, desperate to reach a live human being. He needed someone to send a technician out immediately and spare him from the fury of 30 frozen, furious in-laws waiting one floor above him. I heard exactly how that phone call went later that night, through a frantic, emotionally shattered voicemail Derek left on my blocked number. He had finally gotten through to a customer service representative and immediately started demanding to know why the house had been cut off in the middle of a blizzard. He rattled off the address and ordered them to restore service at once. The representative, composed professional doing her job, would have pulled the account up on her screen. She would have asked for his name, then calmly explained that he had no authorization to make changes or inquiries on that account. Derek described in his tearful message how he had raised his voice at the woman insisting he was the son of the owner and that they were facing a heating emergency. The representative would have held her professional ground. She would have told him that the previous owner, Gerald, had successfully closed the account several days earlier. She would have walked him through the fact that the property was now legally registered to a commercial holding company. And then she would have landed the final blow, the one that split Derek's entire understanding of his situation clean in two. She would have informed him that the new corporate account holder had explicitly requested a complete hard termination of all utility services at that address. she would have made it perfectly clear that the property was legally coded as a condemned structure awaiting immediate commercial demolition. As a result, no utilities could or would be restored under any circumstances. She recommended he vacate the premises for his own safety. I sat in Park City watching snow drift down over the immaculate white peaks, my coffee warm in my hand. I could picture with absolute precision the terror seizing Derek as he stood alone in that dark, freezing basement. Demolition, corporate owner, condemned structure. Those words would have been circling inside his skull like birds of prey. The reality of what had happened would have crashed into him with full force, driving the air straight out of his chest. The massive, expensive house he had treated as his own personal free residence was gone. It had been sold from beneath him while he was busy sleeping in it. He had no legal claim. He had no power. He had no heat. He was a broke, unemployed man standing in a freezing basement with a maxed-out credit card, an enraged and entitled wife, and 30 hostile relatives upstairs waiting for him to resolve a problem that was simply not resolvable. The image of success he and Melissa had so meticulously assembled to dazzle their family wasn't just fracturing. It had dissolved, entirely vanished, leaving nothing behind. The temperature inside the house was dropping by the minute, but the real cold, the deep, inescapable chill of total ruin, had finally reached his core. The heavy timber beams of the Park City ski lodge rose high overhead, framing a sweeping wall of pristine glass. Outside, fat white flakes drifted down from a polished silver sky, settling softly across the jagged ridges of the Wasatch Mountains. Inside the private lounge, the atmosphere was a study in undiluted luxury and ease. A massive stone fireplace commanded the far wall, stacked with thick cedar logs that crackled and spat, pushing a deep, steady warmth through the entire room. I was settled into a plush, oversized leather armchair, feet angled toward the hearth. In my right hand, I held a heavy crystal glass of premium aged spirit, the amber liquid catching the firelight like a lit ember. Soft, instrumental jazz moved through hidden speakers, threading itself into the quiet murmur of well-heeled guests enjoying their winter escapes. I was completely at ease. My pulse was slow and unhurried. I was a man who had steered through a punishing storm and arrived finally at the calm of a distant shore. My phone rested on the polished wood table beside my chair. For the past hour, the screen had stayed dark and still. I knew Derek was likely frozen in place down in that basement, trying to absorb what the utility representative had just told him. He didn't have the nerve to confront me directly after hearing the words condemned and demolition. But Melissa was a different matter entirely. Her whole identity was unraveling in front of the exact audience she had spent years performing for. Her desperation would burn right through any instinct for caution. And right on cue, the dark screen of my phone flared to life. The device began to vibrate aggressively against the polished wood inching across the table. I glanced down at the caller ID. It was Melissa. I didn't answer immediately. I let it vibrate, watching her name flash across the screen again and again. I brought the crystal glass slowly to my lips, letting the rich, warming liquid settle down my throat. I held on to the moment. I was the architect with the only set of blueprints to a building that was actively collapsing around her. On the fifth ring, I reached over, picked up the phone, and pressed the green button. I held the speaker to my ear without uttering a word. I simply let the silence sit there, waiting for her to speak first. "Gerald." She shrieked it, her voice completely unraveled, piercing and shrill. The force of it pushed me to hold the phone several inches from my ear. "It is absolutely freezing in here. The power is completely out, and the water is like ice. My mother is sitting in the living room in 3 winter coats, and my uncle is threatening to book a flight home. Derek went down to the basement, and he is saying complete nonsense about the house being scheduled for demolition. You need to call the utility company right now and fix this. Give them your card number and get the heat back on. You are ruining my entire Christmas. You are humiliating me in front of my whole family. I leaned back in my leather chair and listened to the symphony of chaos playing out behind her voice. I could make out the unmistakable sound of shivering bodies and chattering teeth. I heard a woman who sounded exactly like her arrogant mother declaring loudly that she could see her own breath inside the dining room. I heard the sharp, indignant voices of relatives demanding explanations, demanding hot coffee, demanding somewhere warm to sleep. The entire scene was a toxic, freezing pressure cooker of blame and resentment, and Melissa was pinned right at the center of it, powerless to stop the collapse of the social image she had worked so carefully to construct. I listened to her breathing hard into the phone. She was hyperventilating, gasping in short, ragged pulls as her version of reality came apart piece by piece. She was waiting for me to apologize. She was waiting for me to tell her I was already on the phone with the power company sorting it out. She was waiting for the compliant old man to step forward one final time and bankroll her rescue. I swirled the amber liquid in the glass, watching the firelight shift and dance through the crystal. "Melissa," I said, my voice dropping to a low, smooth, unhurried register. The steadiness of it sat in complete contrast to her hysterical pitch. "There is no bank error. There is no billing mistake. And there is nothing whatsoever I can do to restore heat to that property." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice fracturing with rising panic. "It is your house. You pay the bills. Just call them and fix it." "Oh, that is precisely where you have it wrong," I replied with the slow, measured patience of someone explaining something elementary to a person who should already understand it. "I don't pay the bills anymore. And more to the point, I no longer own that house. I sold the entire property to a commercial real estate developer in a clean cash transaction. The final paperwork was executed weeks ago." The line went completely silent. For a few extraordinary seconds, all I could hear was the steady crack and pop of cedar logs in the fireplace and the faint, distant howl of the Indiana blizzard bleeding through her end of the line. I could practically feel the gears inside her head seizing and grinding as the truth finally forced its way past every wall of denial she had built. "You sold it?" she whispered, her voice barely rising above the noise of her complaining relatives. "But we live here. My family is here. Where are we supposed to go?" "Try the idea. That is a logistical problem you will need to sort out on your own," I told her, a deep and profound satisfaction settling over me like warmth from a fire. "The developer took full legal control of the utilities this morning. Standard corporate demolition protocol requires a hard cutoff of all volatile services to eliminate liability before the bulldozers roll in on the 26th. I have absolutely no legal authority over that address. I cannot call anyone to restore the heat. You are currently trespassing inside a condemned commercial structure." "Gerald, please." She whimpered, every trace of arrogance and entitlement scrubbed clean from her voice, replaced by raw, naked desperation. "Please, you can't do this to us. It's freezing. We have nowhere else to go and no money to get there. My parents will never forgive me. Please help us." I gazed out through the sweeping glass windows, watching soft snow settle over the quiet Park City mountains. I thought about the 3 years I had spent on my knees scrubbing wine stains from antique rugs. I thought about the thousands of dollars she had quietly drained from my accounts to fund designer shoes. I thought about the night she told me to sleep on a broken metal spring in a damp basement, so her parents could occupy the bed I had once shared with my late wife. "You demanded the house for the holidays. Melissa, I said, my voice falling to a whisper of absolute finality. I gave it to you. Try not to freeze. I drew the phone away from my ear, leaving behind the frantic, pitiful sobbing that was already beginning to spill out of her. I pressed the red button and cut the connection for good. The screen went dark. I opened the device settings and went straight to the contact management menu. I pulled up Melissa and tapped the block option. I scrolled to Derek and did exactly the same. I set the phone face down on the polished wooden table and left it there. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full and rich and deeply satisfying, the sound of a precisely engineered structural collapse unfolding exactly as the blueprints had specified. I pressed my head back against the soft leather of the chair and raised my crystal glass toward the roaring fire, offering a quiet, private toast to Lorraine. The storm bearing down on Indiana was going to be savage tonight. But inside my lodge, the temperature was absolutely perfect. Christmas Eve morning arrived wrapped in blinding white sunlight, bouncing off thick layers of fresh snow. In Park City, I woke feeling completely rested and wholly at ease. I ordered a generous room service breakfast and poured myself a hot cup of dark coffee. I crossed to the wide windows of the suite and settled into the small glass table near the glass. I opened my tablet and launched the security application. I had deliberately left the high-definition exterior and entryway cameras fully operational and connected to a dedicated cellular backup line. I intended to watch the final structural collapse with complete clarity. The digital feed from Indiana loaded onto my screen. The neighborhood was buried under 2 feet of snow. My former driveway had become a chaotic frozen lot, packed with the rental vehicles of 30 furious, shivering relatives. The windows of the brick house were frosted entirely over from the inside, a clear sign that the interior temperature had crept dangerously close to freezing. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the feed tick forward. It was precisely 9:00 in the morning. Right on schedule, a heavy white commercial utility truck fitted with a snowplow turned onto the street. A sleek black corporate vehicle followed close behind. They crawled past the buried rental cars and stopped at the foot of the driveway. The doors of the black vehicle swung open first. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out into the bitter air. He wore a heavy wool overcoat over a perfectly tailored suit and gripped a thick metal clipboard in one gloved hand. This was the commercial property manager retained by the luxury development firm. He moved with the rigid, unyielding authority of a man who trafficked exclusively in million-dollar contracts and immovable corporate deadlines. He hadn't come alone. From the white utility truck, 3 more men climbed out. 2 of them were large, imposing private security contractors in heavy black tactical jackets and thick boots. They had the look of professional enforcers whose only job was to guarantee full compliance. The third man had a heavy leather tool belt slung across his shoulder, a commercial locksmith brought in to drill the old locks and secure the perimeter of the condemned building. The 4 of them moved up the icy front walk in a tight, purposeful formation. They didn't look like holiday guests. They looked like an eviction crew. I turned up the volume on the tablet and listened through the crisp audio from the porch camera. The property manager approached the heavy wooden front door. He didn't bother looking for a doorbell. He raised his gloved fist and delivered 4 sharp, aggressive knocks against the solid wood. The sound cut through the frozen morning air with authority. It was a heavy, demanding knock that carried the full legal weight of the situation. For a full minute, nothing moved. The property manager checked the clipboard, confirmed the address, and knocked again, harder this time. Then slowly, the brass handle turned. The door pulled open a few inches. Melissa stood in the gap, and the sight of her was absolutely glorious. The immaculately groomed, imperious woman who had demanded premium champagne and imported cheeses was entirely gone. In her place stood a shivering hollow figure swaddled in a thick, shapeless sleeping bag, with dirty sweatpants visible below and three mismatched sweater layers above. Her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess. Her face had gone pale, and her lips carried a faint bluish tinge from a full night trapped inside a freezing house. She looked precisely like what she had become, a desperate squatter. She asked if she could help them, her voice trembling uncontrollably with the cold. The property manager regarded her with an expression of complete corporate detachment. There was no warm holiday greeting. He glanced at the documents on his clipboard, then looked back at Melissa. He announced in a voice that carried clearly through the microphone that he was the regional director for the Commercial Development Group, and that he was there to conduct the final pre-demolition walkthrough with the previous owner. Melissa's fingers tightened around the edge of the door, her knuckles going white. She stammered, her teeth audibly clicking together, that the previous owner wasn't there. She said he had gone on vacation and that they were his family staying for Christmas. The property manager's expression hardened. He stepped closer to the threshold, and the two security contractors moved in directly behind him, arms folded across their chests, casting a broad, intimidating shadow across the entryway. The manager stated, his tone cutting down to something hard and non-negotiable, that what she was describing was simply not possible. He explained the property had been officially sold and legally transferred to a corporate holding company. He clarified the previous owner had surrendered every right to the address, and that the utility accounts had been severed according to standard safety protocol. He stated plainly that the structure was classified as a condemned commercial site, with total demolition scheduled in exactly 48 hours. He lifted the clipboard and jabbed a gloved finger at the bold text printed across the top of the page. He told her a demolition crew was arriving on the 26th and that he had been informed the property was completely vacant. Yet here he was, looking at a driveway full of vehicles and a house full of people with no legal right to be there. Melissa opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Her eyes moved from the property manager to the security guards, and then to the locksmith who was already running a practiced hand over the brass hardware on the front door. The absolute finality of it was squeezing the air from her body. The manager pressed forward, taking another step and nudging Melissa back into the freezing foyer, and demanded to know exactly who she was and why 30 unauthorized individuals were currently occupying a condemned commercial building with no power, no water, and no legal permission to be on the premises. The word squatters rang out through the audio feed with a beautiful, poetic resonance. She was no longer a wealthy hostess. She was no longer the reigning queen of a suburban castle. A man with a clipboard had officially reduced her to a nameless, unauthorized trespasser. Melissa cried out, her voice buckling under the pressure, insisting they were not squatters. She argued this was her father-in-law's house, and that they had every right to be there. She pleaded that her whole family was inside, and that they were freezing. The property manager did not offer a single ounce of pity. He simply shook his head and drew a thick packet of legal documents from beneath the clip of his board. He said coldly, holding the papers up for her to see, that her father-in-law did not own the house. He stated his corporation owned it. He told her she had no lease, no legal standing, and that she was trespassing on a highly dangerous commercial construction site. I settled back into my plush armchair in Park City and took a long, deeply satisfying sip of coffee. The first domino had been toppled, and the entire fabricated reality she had constructed for her critical, judgmental relatives was about to shatter publicly in the middle of her freezing living room. The final eviction had officially begun. Freezing wind cut through the open front door, carrying a fine mist of snow across the marble foyer. I leaned closer to the glowing screen of my tablet, watching the high-definition security feed with absolute fascination. Melissa was shaking uncontrollably, buried in her dirty sleeping bag, staring at the property manager as though he were an executioner. The brutal reality of her situation was finally bearing down on her, but the true public dismantling of her pride hadn't even gotten started. From somewhere deep in the freezing house, loud, heavy footsteps came pounding down the hallway. Melissa flinched back as her father marched into the entryway. He was a large, pompous man who had spent the entire previous evening loudly holding court with his siblings and cousins about the sprawling estate his accomplished daughter had acquired. He had a heavy wool coat thrown over his pajamas, his face flushed from equal parts cold and irritation. He planted himself behind Melissa, dropped a heavy hand on her shoulder, and fixed the men on the porch with a hard stare. He demanded to know what was happening and why the front door was standing wide open, letting the cold pour in. He puffed his chest out, looked squarely at the property manager, and loudly declared that this was his daughter and son-in-law's private home. He threatened to call the police if the men didn't remove themselves from the property at once. I took another slow, deliberate sip of coffee in Park City. The arrogant father had just walked directly into the trap. The property manager didn't flinch. He didn't retreat a single inch. He simply looked at the older man with an expression of cool, corporate amusement. He stated clearly enough that his voice traveled down the hallway and into the crowded living room that this was absolutely not her home. He announced that the property belonged to a commercial development firm and that every person currently inside the structure was trespassing. The father let out a loud, dismissive laugh and waved his hand. He insisted there had to be some kind of clerical mistake because his daughter Melissa and her husband Derek had recently acquired this sizable suburban estate. He turned to Melissa, fully expecting her to back him up and send the men on their way. But Melissa couldn't speak. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her face buried in the folds of her sleeping bag, trembling from something that went far deeper than the cold. At that moment, Derek appeared from the basement stairwell, moving like a man dragging himself toward a verdict he already knew. He looked completely hollowed out, shoulders, caved face emptied of everything. He crossed the foyer and positioned himself beside his humiliated wife and her bewildered father-in-law. The property manager glanced at his clipboard to confirm a name, then looked directly at my son. He asked if he was Derek. Derek gave a faint nod, his voice barely audible. The manager reached into the thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He produced a heavy stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper, bound together with a thick blue clip. He didn't offer them politely. He drove the stack squarely into Derek's chest, making him take them. The manager announced loudly that he was formally serving them with a 24-hour eviction notice. He stated that the attached documents included the final deed of sale, signed and executed by the lawful owner, Gerald. He made it clear the property had been sold in a cash transaction weeks earlier, and that Derek and Melissa held no lease, no ownership interest, and no legal right to occupy the premises. The foyer went completely silent. The pompous father stared at the legal documents resting in Derek's trembling hands. Color began draining from the older man's face. He turned to his daughter, his voice losing its arrogant edge and taking on something closer to rising panic. He asked Melissa what the man was talking about. He demanded to know whether they actually owned the house. Behind them, the remaining 28 relatives had drifted into the hallway, and the living room drawn toward the commotion at the front door. They were all bundled in heavy coats and blankets, shivering in the freezing house, absorbing every word. The aunts, the uncles, the cousins who had spent 2 days being ordered around by Melissa were now watching her entire manufactured empire crumble to nothing. Derek looked down at the documents, his eyes moving across the first page. He saw my signature. He saw the sale price. He saw the transfer dates laid out in black and white. He shut his eyes and let out a small, broken sob. He confessed to the entire room that they did not own the house. He admitted it had always been my house, and that I had sold it out from under them without a word of warning. The reaction from the assembled family was immediate and merciless. Hushed whispers burst into a loud, chaotic wave of shock and fury. An aunt from the back of the room called out that they had flown across the country to stay in a house that wasn't even theirs. An uncle complained bitterly that they were freezing inside a condemned building because Melissa wanted to play at being wealthy. The illusion of success was gone completely, leaving behind nothing but the bleak reality of two broke entitled adults who had driven away the only person who had ever truly carried them. Melissa pressed her face into her hands and sobbed into the fabric of her sleeping bag. Her father took a large, deliberate step away from her, looking at his daughter with an expression caught somewhere between disgust and deep embarrassment. He had spent months dropping mentions to his golf partners and business contacts about the grand estate his successful daughter owned. In that moment, he understood he had been advertising a lie. He saw plainly that his daughter had been a parasite sustained entirely by the generosity of a man she had treated like hired help. The property manager remained on the porch, completely unmoved by the family implosion playing out in front of him. He pointed a gloved finger at Derek and delivered his final decisive instruction. He stated they had exactly 24 hours to collect their belongings and clear the premises. He warned that if the house was not fully vacated by 9:00 the following morning, he would return with local police to begin making criminal trespassing arrests. He turned and walked back down the icy driveway, the locksmith and the two security contractors falling in close behind him. They loaded into their vehicles and pulled away, leaving the front door gaping open. The winter wind poured into the foyer, sweeping across the polished marble floor. Derek and Melissa stood frozen in the entryway, completely exposed and utterly without cover beneath the furious judging stares of their 30 freezing relatives. I watched them from my warm, quiet retreat in Park City, feeling a deep and absolute sense of satisfaction. The structural collapse was total. There was nothing left of their false kingdom but wreckage. The heavy wooden front door remained wide open, letting the Indiana blizzard push freely into the grand foyer. The property manager had delivered his 24-hour ultimatum and departed, leaving behind a complete vacuum of authority. That vacuum was instantly filled by the furious, wounded rage of Melissa's humiliated family. I leaned forward in my leather chair in Park City, watching the security feed with rapt attention. The paralysis that had gripped all 30 relatives evaporated at once, replaced by a frantic collective need to get out of the condemned building. Melissa's father was the first to break the silence. He turned his back on his daughter, ignoring her sobbing entirely. He announced to the whole gathering loudly that they were leaving immediately. He declared he would not spend another minute shivering inside a stolen house, while his own daughter staged some sick, delusional performance. His voice carried up the grand staircase like a starting shot, and the stampede began. Aunts, uncles, and cousins scrambled back up the stairs, rushing toward the guest rooms to retrieve what they had brought. Through the internal hallway cameras, I watched the chaos unfold in real time. The carefully staged holiday illusion was torn apart within minutes. Suitcases were wrenched open on top of unmade beds. Clothes and toiletries were crammed hastily into canvas bags. The cheap, deflated air mattresses were left where they lay on the hardwood floors. No one was concerned with folding or organizing. They only wanted out of the freezing, lightless house before things got any worse. Down in the foyer, Melissa scrambled frantically to contain the damage. She shuffled from relative to relative, still wrapped in her dirty sleeping bag, grabbing at arms and begging people to wait. She tried pushing some ridiculous story about a bank error and a mix-up with the real estate developer on her cousins. But her family had used up every last drop of patience for her lies. Her uncle shouldered past her with a heavy rolling suitcase and told her flatly to get out of the way. Her cousins looked straight through her as they hauled their bags down the stairs, refusing to acknowledge her existence. The contempt radiating from them was tangible even through the silent video feed. Her father stood in the middle of the living room, stabbing furiously at his phone screen. The driveway was buried under packed snow with rental cars wedged in on all sides, making it impossible for anyone to drive out themselves. He was coordinating a full emergency extraction through a premium rideshare application, booking a fleet of large sport utility vehicles to ferry his extended family to a luxury hotel downtown. He was spending his own money to rescue his relatives from the catastrophic disaster his daughter had engineered. Within 20 minutes, the first dark vehicles began rolling up along the snow-blanketed street. The family streamed toward the front door, pulling winter coats tight around themselves, dragging luggage across the marble tiles, and leaving long, smeared tracks of dirty slush behind them. They said nothing to Derek. My son was parked on the bottom stair of the staircase, face buried in both hands, completely shut down, unable to summon the capacity to process the scale of what he had brought on himself. As the final few relatives filed out through the front door, Melissa made one last desperate lunge to preserve the relationship that mattered most to her. She reached out and seized her mother by the arm. The family matriarch, a woman whose entire identity was built on social standing and an unblemished public image, stopped in the doorway. Melissa wept, openly pleading for financial help, for somewhere to stay, for any shred of forgiveness. She asked her mother to cover a hotel room for her and Derek so they wouldn't end up on the street in the cold. The mother looked at her daughter with an expression of undiluted, unflinching disgust. There was no maternal warmth. There was no word of comfort. She pulled her arm free with a sharp, decisive jerk. When she spoke, it was with a cold and cutting precision that sliced clean through the frozen air. She told Melissa she was a profound embarrassment to the entire family. She said Melissa had humiliated them in front of their extended relatives by dragging them to a condemned freezing house to feed her own pathetic vanity. Then the mother landed the final blow. She told Melissa explicitly not to reach out to them for the remainder of the holiday season. She stated that Melissa and Derek had built this disaster from the ground up by themselves, and they would have to find their way through it without a single dollar of family money. She turned, stepped out onto the snowy porch, and got into the waiting vehicle without glancing back once. The large sport utility vehicles pulled from the curb, their red taillights swallowed by the swirling white of the snowstorm. The street went completely quiet. The exodus was finished. Inside the house, Derek and Melissa were left entirely on their own, standing in the freezing dark foyer, surrounded by the muddy boot prints of everyone who had just walked out on them and the wreckage of the lie they had been living. Their bank accounts held nothing. Their credit cards were maxed to their limits. Their family had walked away in disgust, and they had exactly 23 hours to load their lives into boxes before the police came to arrest them for criminal trespassing. I reached over and tapped the tablet screen, gently closing the security application. The performance had concluded, and the final act was absolutely flawless. I leaned back in the armchair, letting the deep, steady warmth of the fireplace settle across my face. I had engineered a structural collapse of enormous scale, and it had executed with brilliant mathematical precision. I lifted my glass of aged scotch and took a slow, contented sip, entirely at peace. A full week had gone by since the eviction. 7 uninterrupted days of complete quiet. I was out on the private terrace of my Park City lodge, breathing in the sharp mountain air, working through a novel I had neglected for years. My phone sat undisturbed on the small glass table next to my coffee. I had unblocked Derek's number earlier that morning, not out of any readiness to forgive, but because a structural engineer always verifies that the demolition was fully successful. Right on schedule, the phone began vibrating against the glass. I let it ring 3 times before lifting the device and answering without making a sound. The audio quality on the other end was absolutely wretched. Through the speaker came the unmistakable muffled atmosphere of a cheap roadside motel. A police siren drifted faintly in the distance, and a heavy commercial truck ground past, rattling whatever thin windows surrounded my son. Behind him, I could clearly hear Melissa crying, not her usual theatrical performance designed to move an audience, but the hollow, spent weeping of a woman who had exhausted every option available to her. Derek pulled in a ragged, shaking breath. He said my name, his voice fracturing beneath the weight of what his life had become. He sounded utterly demolished, every trace of the arrogant entitlement he had carried, like a birthright just 7 days earlier, was gone. The begging started immediately tumbling out in a desperate, tangled rush of apologies and rationalizations. He told me they had burned through their last remaining dollars on a filthy motel room just off the interstate. He admitted their bank accounts were completely overdrawn, and every credit card was maxed. He explained that his luxury vehicle was on the verge of repossession because he had missed 3 straight lease payments. He sobbed into the phone and asked me to wire just enough money to secure a small apartment somewhere. He swore he would pay back every cent. He promised he'd take a second job. He begged me to remember that he was my only son, and that I couldn't simply leave him to rot in a dangerous motel off a highway. I sat in the morning light on the terrace, listening to him fall apart with complete emotional detachment. Not one flicker of guilt or parental obligation stirred in me. I waited until he had fully spent himself and the line went quiet. Then I spoke, measured, calm, and precise. I told him that my role as his personal automated teller machine had ended the exact moment he allowed his wife to treat me like a household servant in the home I had built with his mother. I reminded him of the morning he sat at my dining table and stared at his plate in silence, while Melissa exiled me to a broken spring mattress in a cold basement. I told him that an adult man is required to carry the full, unmitigated consequences of his own choices. Derek attempted to cut in with another excuse, but I gave him no opening. I told him I had spent 3 years quietly absorbing their contempt while privately bankrolling their vanity. I made it unambiguously clear that the financial pipeline was permanently closed, and that no volume of begging would ever reopen it. I advised him to set aside his pride walk into the nearest retail establishment and apply for an entry-level position because honest physical work was the only thing with any chance of repairing the deep flaws in his character. I told him this would be my last communication with him, and that any future attempts to reach me would go directly to my legal counsel. He let out a loud, anguished cry and pleaded with me not to end the call. I didn't wait to hear the rest of it. I pulled the phone from my ear and pressed the button, cutting the line to silence. I went straight into settings and blocked his number permanently, making certain he could never disturb my peace again. The final thread was cut. They were completely on their own now, left to wrestle with the crushing weight of serious debt and hard physical work. I set the phone face down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and drew in a long, satisfying breath of cold winter air. Exactly 1 month later, that savage Indiana blizzard feels like little more than a dim, half-remembered bad dream. Right now, I am seated on an enormous wraparound balcony perched high above the glittering turquoise waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The Florida sun beats its warm, tropical heat down onto my face, carrying the soft, soothing smell of salt air and hibiscus blossoms on the morning breeze. There are no snowplow blades grinding against the pavement below. There are no panicked calls about failing furnaces or shut-off notices. There is only the steady, rhythmic pulse of ocean waves rolling in against bright white sand. I purchased this ultra-luxury penthouse condominium entirely in cash, using a modest fraction of the millions generated by the quick sale of the Indiana property. The whole transition was seamless. I lift my dark roast coffee and take a slow, deliberate sip, letting the bold, rich flavor settle on my tongue. The ceramic mug sits on a sleek glass patio table, spotless, not a trace of caramel latte residue anywhere on it. Inside, the condominium floor-to-ceiling windows allow the morning sun to pour across flawless, imported marble floors. There are no dirty dishes accumulating in my state-of-the-art kitchen. There are no raucous, loud dinner parties shaking the walls on a Tuesday night. The air inside my home is perfectly clean, perfectly controlled, and perfectly mine. I think back to that cold, damp, unfinished basement where my daughter-in-law had so casually tried to exile me. I think of that broken metal spring in the old pull-out couch. The gap between that proposed banishment and where I sit today is nothing short of magnificent. I have fully reclaimed my sovereignty. Resting on the glass table just beside my coffee is a small, polished silver frame holding a photograph of Lorraine. It is the photo we took on our 30th wedding anniversary. She is wearing that luminous, beautiful smile, her dark hair lifting softly in the breeze. I reach out and trace the smooth edge of the frame with my fingertips. Some narrow-minded people might suggest that by selling the house we built together, I somehow betrayed her memory or dismantled our family's legacy. But looking at her smiling face in the warm morning light, I know the precise opposite to be true. I honored her memory in the deepest and most protective way imaginable. Lorraine and I did not spend 4 decades grinding ourselves down to nothing, setting aside every spare penny and giving up our own personal comforts just to bankroll the ungrateful vanity of a spoiled daughter-in-law and a spineless son. We built what we built to provide a foundation of security and stability, not to serve as an endless slush fund for parasitic entitlement. By dismantling that physical structure and safeguarding our financial assets, I protected everything Lorraine and I actually stood for. I protected our dignity. I protected our life's work from being methodically stripped away by 2 adults who flatly refused to respect the very hands that had sustained them. I settled back into my plush lounge chair, shut my eyes, and angled my face up toward the brilliant morning sun. The absolute quiet of this penthouse is the finest symphony I have ever had the pleasure of hearing. It is a thick, full, weighty silence, undisturbed by selfish demands, untouched by petty manipulation, and completely free of parental guilt. I spent my entire professional career engineering massive structures built to carry the heavy load of the world. But today on this balcony, I am carrying no weight whatsoever. My foundation is solid. My personal boundaries are permanently reinforced. I am a wealthy, dignified man, savoring the calm, spectacular peace that follows a well-executed extraction. The most important lesson drawn from this entire experience is that unconditional love does not require unconditional financial enabling. Real family is built on a bedrock of mutual respect, genuine gratitude, and shared responsibility, not on manipulation and entitled demands. When you allow someone to repeatedly disrespect you under your own roof while cheerfully burning through your hard-earned money, you are not helping them become better people. And that is where Gerald's story leaves us sitting on that sunlit balcony, carrying nothing except the quiet satisfaction of a man who finally chose himself. I won't pretend it came without cost. Walking away from the house he and Lorraine built together from a son he had once believed in completely, that kind of decision leaves marks. But I believe God does not allow a man to be stripped of his dignity indefinitely without also providing a way through. The path Gerald found was not easy, and it was not painless. It was, however, entirely his. And in the end, that was the only foundation worth standing on. If these father stories have taught us anything, it is that love without limits is not love. It is a slow surrender. And true family justice does not always arrive with an apology. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a penthouse balcony, a warm morning sun, and the sound of the ocean reminding you that peace was always possible. Here is what I hope you take with you today. First, never confuse financial generosity with unconditional obligation. Giving has to have a floor or it becomes exploitation. Second, when someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them the first time, not the 10th. Third, protecting what you and your partner built together is not selfishness. It is the most honest form of loyalty you can offer their memory. Fourth, silence and patience in the right hands are more powerful than any argument you could ever win out loud. If this story moved you, I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done, or what part of Gerald's journey stayed with you. If you know someone who needs to hear this today, please pass it along. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories, so you're here for everyone that follows, thank you for spending this time with me. Until the next story, take care of yourself.